By the summer of 1976, her body weighed just 68 pounds. Her knees were shattered from constant kneeling. Her lungs were infected. Her body showed signs of extreme starvation. Prosecutors would later say something chilling. Even days before her death, she could have been saved if someone had simply called a doctor. But no one did. Instead, the people closest to her believed something very different. They believed she was possessed by demons. They believed her suffering was not medical, but spiritual. And they believed the only way to save her was through prayer, ritual, and exorcism. This is not a horror movie. This is the real story that inspired the Exorcism of Emily Rose. And at the center of it was a young woman named Anneliese Michel. Her death would spark one of the most controversial trials in modern German history and force an entire country to confront the terrifying consequences of belief when it replaces care. A childhood shaped by faith. Before her name became associated with possession and exorcism, Anneliese Michel was simply a girl growing up in post-war West Germany. She was born on September 21, 1952, in the deeply Catholic region of Bavaria. Religion there was not casual. It shaped daily life, morality, and identity. Sin was not an abstract idea. It was something real, something that demanded punishment and repentance. Suffering itself was often seen as a path toward purification. Anneliese's family lived by these beliefs completely. Her parents, Anna and Joseph Michel, were intensely devout Roman Catholics. They attended church several times a week. One relative had considered becoming a priest. Others had joined religious orders. Faith wasn't simply practiced inside the Michel household. It governed it. Every aspect of life was filtered through ideas of guilt, penance, and spiritual struggle. But there was also an unspoken burden hanging over the family. Years before Anneliese was born, her mother had a child out of wedlock, something that carried enormous shame in conservative Catholic Bavaria. At her wedding, she was forced to wear a black veil, a public symbol of sin. The child later died during surgery. The guilt of that tragedy never truly left the family. From an early age, Anneliese was raised with the belief that suffering could atone for sin, not just her own, but the sins of others. The first signs. As a teenager, Anneliese was described as quiet, intelligent, and deeply religious. She prayed constantly. Sometimes she performed acts of self-denial, sleeping on cold floors or denying herself comfort. To her, pain had meaning. But when she was 16 years old, something frightening happened. In 1968, Anneliese suddenly collapsed at school. Witnesses said she stared blankly ahead, unresponsive, as though trapped inside her own body. When she regained consciousness, she remembered nothing. Then it happened again, and again. Soon the episodes became more violent. She experienced convulsions, blackouts, and crushing sensations in her chest that made it difficult to breathe. Eventually, doctors diagnosed her with temporal lobe epilepsy. Today, this condition is well understood. But in the late 1960s, knowledge about it was limited. Temporal lobe epilepsy does more than cause seizures. It can also trigger hallucinations, intense emotional states, religious visions, and feelings of overwhelming fear. For the person experiencing it, these sensations can feel completely real. Doctors prescribed medication and hospitalized her for treatment. But over the years, her condition didn't improve. In fact, it seemed to grow worse. Visions and fear. By the early 1970s, Anneliese began reporting disturbing experiences. She claimed she could see demonic faces. She heard voices telling her she was damned and destined for hell. Even more troubling, she developed an aversion to religious objects she once loved. She recoiled from crucifixes. She avoided holy water. For a deeply religious family, these changes were terrifying. Doctors diagnosed her with depression and psychosis, adding antipsychotic medications to her treatment. Still, nothing seemed to help. In the Michel household, a different explanation slowly began to take shape. Perhaps this wasn't illness. Perhaps it was something darker. Possession. The exorcisms begin. The idea of possession did not appear suddenly. It grew slowly, shaped by Anneliese's symptoms, her upbringing, and the beliefs of those around her. During a religious pilgrimage, an elderly woman reportedly claimed Anneliese smelled of decay. Others pointed to her violent reactions to religious objects. To her family, these were no longer medical symptoms. They were signs. By 1974, the Michel family was convinced that Anneliese was possessed. They began pleading with Catholic priests to perform an exorcism. At first, the church refused. Exorcisms were extremely rare and required special permission. But one priest, Father Ernst Alt, became convinced that Anneliese's case was genuine. He petitioned the bishop for approval. Finally, in September 1975, permission was granted quietly and privately. 2 priests were assigned to perform the ritual. From that moment forward, everything changed. At Anneliese's request, all medical treatment stopped. Doctors were no longer consulted. Medication was discontinued. Her fate was now entirely in the hands of the priests. 67 exorcisms. Over the next 10 months, Anneliese underwent 67 exorcism sessions. Some lasted 4 hours or more. They were conducted once or twice each week in her parents' home. The priests followed a 17th century Catholic ritual, commanding demons to reveal themselves and depart. During these sessions, Anneliese screamed, growled, and contorted her body. Her voice sometimes changed dramatically. The priests claimed that several demons spoke through her. Among the names they reported were Lucifer, Judas, Cain, Nero, and even Adolf Hitler. To them, it was a battle for her soul. But physically, Anneliese was collapsing. She performed hundreds of genuflections, dropping to her knees repeatedly in prayer. The strain shattered the bones in her knees. Her body became covered in bruises. She stopped eating. She refused water. Instead of recognizing these as medical emergencies, those around her interpreted them as part of the spiritual struggle. Some believed fasting would help drive the demons out. Meanwhile, her body was failing. She developed pneumonia, dehydration, and severe malnutrition. Doctors later testified that even at this stage, medical care could have saved her. But no one called for help. Her final days. On June 30th, 1976, Anneliese endured one final exorcism. It lasted nearly 4 hours. Her last known words were quiet and fragile. She asked for absolution, and to her mother, she whispered, "Mother, I'm afraid." The next morning, she was found dead in her bed. She was 23 years old. The autopsy was clear. Cause of death: malnutrition and dehydration. It had not been sudden. It had been prolonged neglect. The trial. Authorities charged Anneliese's parents and both priests with negligent homicide. The trial began in 1978 and quickly became a national spectacle. The defense argued that Anneliese herself had chosen spiritual treatment and refused medical care. They claimed religious freedom, but prosecutors argued something different. They said the young woman was clearly mentally ill and dying in plain sight, and that those responsible for her care had a duty to intervene. The court ultimately agreed. The judge ruled that Anneliese Michel had not been possessed. She had been suffering from severe mental illness, and her death could have been prevented. All 4 defendants were found guilty of negligent homicide. They received suspended sentences. Legacy and debate. The verdict did not end the debate. Even today, opinions remain divided. Some believers still argue that Anneliese was possessed, or that she willingly sacrificed herself to atone for the sins of others. Her grave has become a pilgrimage site for certain visitors. Others see her story as a devastating example of mental illness misunderstood and untreated. The tragedy also inspired the film The Exorcism of Emily Rose, which dramatized the case and left the truth deliberately ambiguous. Reality, however, was not ambiguous. Anneliese Michel was not killed by demons. She was failed by human choices. The real horror of her story is not supernatural. It is what happens when fear overrides care, when belief replaces responsibility, and when suffering is mistaken for meaning.